Yeah, I'm Ed Shackelford, President of the Colorado Senior Lobby. It is my privilege to welcome you to a Colorado Senior Lobby's special event. This is important for all who are interested in becoming someone who influences policy and not just someone who discusses policy. To me, this is making it happen. The Senior Lobby was organized in 1980 as a nonpartisan organization committed to enhancing the life of seniors through education, through analysis and advocacy of legislation, and transmission of legislative information statewide. The Senior Lobby does not endorse any candidate or political party. I encourage you to go to our webpage, coloradoseniorlobby.org. You will see information on the organization and will see our weekly summary of legislation affecting seniors, including positions of the Senior Lobby. The ultimate folly is to think that something crucial to your welfare is being taken care of for you. Our effectiveness is dependent on our membership. Some can provide financial support. Others will take a more active role and participate in our lobbying activities. But every member adds to our influence. Membership is only $30 for an individual and $75 for an organization. You can support the Senior Lobby by going to our webpage, coloradoseniorlobby.org, or phoning us at 303-832-4535. Thank you.
Well, good morning. Again, I'm Barry Sarver from House District 2, Wash Park area of Denver, Colorado. And I'm proud to introduce our next speaker. He's been a professor for over 4 decades across the United States. He was raised in Texas, but he taught and lectured in numerous states and cities around the country. But as you'll find out, his passion has been with determining good legislation and analyzing for members of our legislature. And so we're happy to have him here to go through the tools we have. I'd like you to meet Lou Irwin. Lou Irwin is right here, and he can explain the best way to enhance lobbying.
Thank you, Barry, and thank you to the Senior Lobby. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here. It's always a pleasure to be able to speak to people who are interested in public policy and engaged in the political process. My name is Lou Irwin, and I am a policy director for State Senator Irene Aguilar. I will be talking to you today about the legislature in several different segments. I will start out by talking about the composition of the legislature, who the members are, how they're elected. I'll talk about the committee structure, which is the essence of how legislation gets analyzed and passed through the legislative process. I'll talk about the role of legislative legal services, which is a very important component in getting bills passed. And then we'll get to the heart of the matter, how a bill becomes law. And then I will talk a little bit about guidelines for citizen lobbyists, how you testify, what to expect, and so forth. I think we agreed when we were talking about organizing this talk that it should be informal. And so I will proceed on that assumption. If I say something that is unclear, that you need clarification of, or you have a question about it, go ahead and ask it, and I'll be happy to address it as we go along. At the end, we've scheduled a fair amount of time for question and answer, so if something slips by you and you think of it later on, we can certainly come back to it in the question and answer session to follow. So, the Colorado General Assembly, like every state but one, it is a bicameral system. There are 2 chambers that meet by constitutional mandate no later than the second Wednesday in January. That day next year falls on January 8th, and that is the day that the legislature will convene. It must adjourn no more than 120 calendar days after it begins. And so that usually means about the second week in May. There are two chambers. The House of Representatives has 65 members. Right now there are 35 Democrats and 30 Republicans in the House. The Senate has 35 members. Right now there are 18 Democrats or there will be 18 Democrats after a vacancy is filled next week, and there are 17 Republicans. The party that holds the majority in each chamber is the one that is usually selected for chairmanships of the committees and usually has a majority number of members on the committee. So the party that has the most number of members in each chamber has a significant advantage in terms of advancing its legislative agenda. Representatives and senators are elected at a general election, which is, again, constitutionally on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November of even-numbered years. State representatives run every 2 years, and they are limited to 4 terms in succession for a total of 8 years. Senators are elected at the same time for 4-year terms. Approximately half of the Senate is elected every 2 years. They can serve for 2 consecutive 4-year terms, or a total of 8 years as well. The Colorado General Assembly is anxious that its funds be expended on the priorities of the state and not its legislators. So it is very stingy in the amount of support that it gives to its legislators. Each legislator, this is representative or senator, has funding for 1 part-time paid assistant. They are paid while the legislature is in session and not thereafter. Much of the work of the legislature depends on volunteers, and there is therefore ample opportunity for volunteers to work with legislators and to influence the legislative process. Lately, there have been some recall elections in Colorado. The Constitution reserves to the people the right to recall, and it places, right now, it places no constraints on the reasons for that recall. The recall provision is said by the Constitution to be liberally construed. In other words, anybody can be recalled for any reason, the way the Constitution reads at this time. In order to be recalled, if we're talking about legislators now, it requires signatures from electors or voters equal to 1/4 of the number of people who voted for that office in the past election. So that is a composition of the House and the Senate. Each chamber sets its own rules of deliberation and elects its own officers. The House of Representatives elects a speaker from the majority party, and then it elects a majority leader. The majority leader is the one who, in consultation with the speaker and the rest of the leadership, determines the agenda, that is, the schedule, which bills will be heard when. And the speaker also assigns bills to particular committees. The majority leader is elected by the majority caucus. The party that holds the majority elects the majority leader, and the majority leader is the one called upon by the speaker at the start of every session, and he or she is the one who brings motions to the floor. In the Senate, there is a president. The president is elected by the entire Senate. The president is expected to be Morgan Carroll, a Democrat. As in the House, the Senate has a majority leader and an assistant majority leader. They are elected by the caucus. And the majority leader is the one who brings bills to the floor and generally opens every session. The majority leader, by the way, is expected, has been chosen by the Democratic caucus to be Raleigh Heath of Denver, and the assistant majority leader is Senator Irene Aguilar. In the House, I didn't mention, the Speaker of the House is Mark Ferrandino, and the majority leader is Dickie Hollinghorst at the present time. Okay, so the heart of the legislative process is its committee structure and how the committees operate. So the House and Senate both have committees that are aligned more or less in parallel. But the House and the Senate are each jealous of their own prerogatives, and they reserve the right to call their committees whatever they want to. And particularly in years when one chamber is held by a different party from the one that is a majority in the other party, in the other chamber, there is often a lot of gamesmanship that goes into naming the committees as a means of showing their own party flag and what their priorities are. But right now, both the House and the Senate, and for the coming year, the House and the Senate are both controlled by Democrats, and so the committee structure is more or less aligned. So the committees deal with the substantive issues of the bills. These are called committees of reference, and they are the committees to which a bill will be assigned once it's filed. So going down the list, most of these are self-explanatory. The House has an Agriculture, Livestock, and Natural Resources Committee. In the Senate, it's called Agriculture, Natural Resources, and Energy. Both chambers have an Appropriations Committee. So any bill that requires an appropriation must go through this committee, but usually after it has gone through another substantive committee. The House has a committee called Business, Labor, Economic, and Workforce Development, and the Senate has a committee called Business, Labor, and Technology. Both chambers have an Education Committee. In the House, there's a Committee on Health, Insurance, and the Environment. In the Senate, it's Health and Human Services. In the House, Human Services is put into another committee called Public Health Care and Human Services. Both chambers have a Judiciary Committee that deals with all criminal justice matters and the judiciary. Both chambers have a Local Government Committee. Both chambers have a State, Veterans, and Military Affairs Committee. This is a committee that takes a hodgepodge of legislation, certainly dealing with state matters, veterans, military affairs, and anything that the majority party wants to kill goes to that committee. So it's sometimes called a kill committee. The House has a Transportation and Energy Committee. That's where they put their energy. In the Senate, it's just a Transportation Committee. So these are the committees of reference. These are the committees that meet during the session of the General Assembly. Now, there are statutory committees that meet year-round, and some of them deal with matters, technical matters that always apply. Legislative Legal Services Oversight is one such committee. They control legislative legal services, which we'll talk about more. The Joint Budget Committee is arguably the most powerful committee in the legislature because it sets the budget. It deliberates on the budget and recommends the budget for passage. It receives the budget from the governor submits a budget, and then the legislature does what it wants to about the budget. Legislative Council is another statutory committee, and Legislative Council just deals with the technical management of the General Assembly. Now, there are numerous others that come and go. For instance, right now there's a Flood Disaster Review Committee that is dealing with a lot of the flood issues. There is a Health Benefits Exchange Review Committee, which is the oversight committee for the healthcare benefits exchange that we have in Colorado now that is implementing the provisions of the Affordable Care Act. Okay, so let's talk about the legislative legal services. Because that's very important, and you need to know about it and how it functions once you become involved with a particular bill. Legislative Legal Services is nonpartisan. It drafts bills in cooperation with legislators. So, a legislator has a bill, and this may be something that you suggested or that they feel strongly enough about to file a bill. They will go to Legislative Legal Services and say, I want to file a bill on establishment of municipal parks. So there will be a roster of attorneys in Legislative Legal Services that focus on different areas of legislation. And one of those will be concerned with local government, will be a specialist in the law relating to local government. So that attorney would be assigned to draft that bill. The attorney does draft that bill using language that is mysterious to most people and convoluted to a degree that appears to be intended to make it difficult to understand, although that is not what they will say. In short, it's drafted in legal language, and there are conventions about how that legal language has to be formatted, outlined, what words are used, what terms are defined, and so forth. Many legislators, of course, are attorneys, but they still do not draft their own bills. The bills have to be drafted by Legislative Legal Services. Now, Legislative Legal Service attorneys deal only with legislators. They do not deal with the public. They are not people that you go and talk to, with one exception. The attorneys in this division of state government are bound to confidentiality with the legislators with whom they are working. And that means that legislator specifically, no other legislators. The only exceptions are if that legislator designates someone else that they can speak to. And this includes members of the public. So the exception would be if you are working with your state representative, drafting a bill, you've been involved, you've been at stakeholder meetings, you are knowledgeable about it, and that legislator sees you as an asset, which they often do, and they want you to be able to talk to the drafter of the legislation. Then they will tell that attorney, they will tell that drafter, yes, Barry Sarver has permission to speak to you about this. And under those circumstances, then you can talk to them. Otherwise, their job is not to deal with the public. Their job is to deal with the legislator and to serve them in drafting their legislation. Okay, any questions so far about the composition of the legislature or anything that I've said before we start talking about how a bill becomes law? Barry. The question is, can a member of the public talk to an attorney from Legislative Legal Services during the committee hearing? The answer is no, unless they have received clearance from the legislator. Okay, well, let's get to how a bill becomes law then. I understand that you have a flow sheet there, and I will start talking and you can sort of follow along. And I haven't looked at this spreadsheet, at this flow sheet in some time, so if I say anything that appears to be divergent with the flow that you see there, let me know and we'll try to reconcile it. So, Barry has decided that he wants his state representative to pass a bill providing protection for citizens who live around parks, to enable them to protect their city parkland, let's say. So he goes to a state representative and says, I think this is a good idea, we ought to do this. The state rep says, Barry, that's a wonderful idea. That is something that I believe in and I would like to support, so I will draft a bill. Now, different legislators operate in different ways. I speak only from my experience with Senator Aguilar, who goes overboard in, she doesn't go overboard, but she does a very good job of preparing herself with people who are going to be affected by the bill, who are championing the bill, and who may be opposed to the bill before it ever even gets to the drafting stage. So she will hold stakeholder meetings, and most legislators do. They will hold stakeholder meetings. These are informal gatherings, usually at the Capitol, where they will invite you to come in and talk about the bill, the potential bill, what your concerns are, what you would like to see in it, or what you definitely do not want to see in it. A bill that you want to see passed, or a bill that you think there is no need for, that would be intrusive, would be contrary to the interest of the group that you represent or to yourself. Most legislators who are smart about it, and most of them are fairly smart, will hold these stakeholder meetings so that they know the lay of the land. They know how people feel about the legislation, and they are very concerned with getting at least a substantive core of supporters in line before they even start drafting the bill. But a lot of times it doesn't work out that way, and in any event, they have to have the bill drafted, and they have to have Legislative Legal Services draft the bill, and they need to file the bill by a certain time. Now, some bills have to be filed by mid-December or earlier, but constitutionally, bills can be introduced at any time during the General Assembly. The leadership likes to get them lined up, and there will usually be caucus meetings in the fall or winter before the legislature convenes, so that the caucus, that is a given political party, knows what the major pieces of legislation they can expect to be seeing. And strategy will begin at that point about how it will be scheduled, when they will come up. Well, once a legislator has stakeholders in mind and has the basic components of the bill in mind, they go to the attorney and legal services and they say, this is what I want the bill to show. So then the attorney goes into their cubicle and they come up with this mystifying language that says, in principle, what the legislator wants to be enacted. At that point, it is in appropriate legislative language. It will then go to, it has to be introduced. A bill can be introduced in either chamber, although constitutionally, revenue bills that whose primary purpose is to generate revenue, must originate in the House. This doesn't mean that a bill that has some revenue attached to it, like a fine for something, but the primary purpose of the bill is regulatory, that could begin in the Senate. But bills primarily oriented toward revenue have to originate in the House. But otherwise, bills can originate in either chamber. And once they're introduced, they are given a number. The formal introduction of a bill is called the first reading of the bill, and it is literally that. The clerk reads the title of the bill, and there may or may not be anyone in the chamber at that time. Technically, the chamber is in session, but bills, often a bunch of them, are read across the table all at once, just the title. Now, in theory, a bill has to be read in its entirety. That is, the entire language of the bill, whether it's a half a page or 100 pages. But by unanimous consent, this can be waived. And except for one occasion in the last session when one of the parties got their nose totally out of joint and insisted on a 60-page bill being read at length, this almost never happens. And you can see why the legislature would come to a grinding halt if every single bill had to be read in detail, and both parties respect that and do not abuse it, except in rare circumstances. So the bill is read, the title of the bill, and that's called the first reading. And at that time, the Speaker of the House, if it's in the House, or the President, if it's in the Senate, will assign it to a committee of reference, one of those committees of reference that I mentioned earlier. That means it will be assigned to that committee for a hearing and for debate and discussion. The public hearing then is scheduled by the chair of the committee of reference. If it's a major bill, or if it's a bill that is, politically of high visibility, then the chair will usually be in communication with the leadership about what a good time is to schedule that bill. For strategic reasons, some bills are introduced very early on. Sometimes they are introduced late in the session. Sometimes the way bills are scheduled, Depends on strategic considerations. For instance, all the firearms bills were scheduled on the same day before two different committees in parallel. That was a strategic decision by the Democratic majority last spring as a means of trying to deal with a very difficult and volatile issue as quickly as possible. In retrospect, it may not have been the wisest policy, but that is an example of a strategic decision that's made about when a bill is to be introduced. There have been cases, Senator Aguilar, for instance, had a bill concerning a statewide health care plan 2 sessions ago, and she wanted to introduce it, but the majority leadership told her to wait until the House dealt with domestic partnership legislation, because it has to do with politics and who has to vote on what, and they wanted to get that out of the way before they had to deal with another controversial issue. As it turned out, that ended up delaying it to the point where it couldn't be passed, and that happens. But my main point here is that scheduling is a strategic decision that is made by the chair if it's non-controversial, whenever the calendar will admit it. If it's going to be a controversial or substantive issue, it will usually be scheduled for a time decided by the chair in consultation with the leadership with the majority leadership. Okay, the committee hearing then, this is the first really critical point, and this is the second point that you will have your potential impact. The first point, remember, was at those stakeholder meetings where ideally you were involved at the very beginning and you were on board with the legislator, and they know where you stand, you know what the bill is like, you are acquainted with what the bill says. Even if you have not been talking to the attorney, you will, by the time it is in committee, have access to the full text of the bill. And I have a handout that I will make available later on that shows you how you can follow a bill through the legislative process and get the wording on the bill and so forth. So, but this is your chance now to testify. So the Committee of Reference has to hold a public hearing on every bill. Every bill that is filed before the legislature must have a public hearing. And that is held before the Committee of Reference. The committee proceeds in the following way. First of all, the legislator who is sponsoring the bill addresses the committee and introduces the bill. They describe, usually briefly, the rationale, what the major provisions are, and so forth. This usually is fairly short, can be a couple of minutes. If it's a simple bill, it can be 10 or 15 minutes if it's a more complicated bill. At that point, members of the committee then can question the legislator. And this can go on indefinitely, although typically, even for a controversial bill, it could last an hour. So we're an hour into the committee hearing and we haven't gotten past yet the legislator who is sponsoring the bill. Now, once that process is completed, there may be some speeches, there may be a little posturing, there may be a little, back and forth, but no substantive debate is supposed to be occurring at that point. After all the committee members have addressed questions to the legislator, after they've run out of questions, then the chair will open it up to the public portion of the hearing. And that's when the citizens are invited to speak. Now, when you arrive at the hearing, before it begins, you will be asked to sign in if you intend to testify. So you will sign your name and you will indicate whether you are in favor of the bill, opposed to the bill, or neutral on the bill. There's nothing binding about this. It's just that the clerk of the committee needs to have a record of everyone who testified. And also because the people who testify will generally do so in an organized manner. Usually the proponents together, the opponents, and those who are neutral together. Now, who gets to go first? That is technically up to the chair, but always in my experience, I've never seen an exception to this. The chair will defer to the legislator who is sponsoring the bill, and the legislator can say, I would like the proponents to go first, or I would like the opponents to go first. And then the chair will call up people to testify from the list. And so that's why your name needs to be on the list. They will call you up if you are a proponent. We'll call up all the proponents, time allowing, and then we'll call up all the opponents and then those who are neutral. Now, so that will all happen, and then in this case I'm talking about a bill that does not have a huge number of people to testify. So if there are not a huge number of people to testify, the chair will usually entertain testimony from anyone who wants to speak. After the chair has called everyone on the list, they will then ask, does anyone who is not on the list wish to speak in favor or against or about this bill? And so at that point, say you came in late, there was a big crowd, you weren't able to get to the table, or you forgot, or, as sometimes happens, the page with your particular name on it gets misplaced and it gets put in the stack of another bill or something. So for whatever reason, if your name hasn't been called and you want to testify, then you raise your hand, you will be invited to come forward and to testify. Now, again, technically, the number of people that can testify and the time that they have to speak is at the discretion of the chair. As a practical matter, the chair will allow everyone to speak, at least normally will allow everyone to speak who is there, who can. Now, in some cases, there will be hundreds of people showing up to testify. Under those circumstances, the first thing the chair will probably do is say, we would like for you to limit your comment to 2 minutes. And they will enforce that time limit. Very seldom have I seen a chair prevent anyone from talking, that is, cut off testimony, except in those cases where there is such an overwhelming number of people that they simply can't be accommodated in the time available. On some issues such as that, there will be an agreement beforehand between the majority and minority members of the committee to place an overall time limit, say 2 hours for the proponents, 2 hours for the opponents, and then they will go down the list, and as many people as can testify within that period get to testify. Now, in actuality, if you have enough people testifying for 2 or 3 minutes in a 2-hour window, usually there are not very many unique things that are going to be said toward the end of that 2-hour period. And so it is not a real obstacle to democratic participation to limit debate in that way. But as I say, most chairs of both parties, and I've seen chambers controlled by both parties, chairs try their best to truly accommodate the opinion of the public at these committee hearings. Once everyone has testified that says they want to testify, if the chair, seeing no more people wishing to testify, will gavel the public portion of the hearing to an end. At that point, the public then just becomes a witness to the proceedings. At that point, it's opened up for discussion within the committee, and that's where then the debate goes back and forth, always under the control of the chair. And eventually, the debate should lead to a motion. Before a vote is taken, there will be back and forth debate. Then typically the chair will ask the legislator who's sponsoring to summarize the argument for the bill. And then after that, if there are no further questions from the committee, a vote is taken. In order to pass, a bill must receive a majority vote. That is, they must receive one more vote in favor than in opposition. A tie vote is a failure to pass. Thank you. The question is, when do amendments come in? Amendments come in after the debate on the bill. Amendments can come in at the beginning. In other words, there may be a bill has been drafted, the legislator introduces the bill, and usually not at that point. The legislator may say, there is a problem with this bill and I will be introducing an amendment. Most often, the public speaks, the public portion is closed, then amendments can be introduced. And amendments can be introduced by the legislator proposing the bill or by members of the committee. Okay, so, and then those amendments have to be voted on, and until all the amendments are taken care of, then the bill will be voted on as amended. Okay, so at that point, then the vote is taken. If there is at least one more vote in favor than in opposition, the bill will be reported to the chamber, to the committee of the whole in the chamber with a favorable recommendation. If it isn't passed, or if there is at least if there is a majority in opposition to the bill, then the bill will fail. Very often at that point, a revised motion will be made to postpone the bill indefinitely, which just reverses the vote. And those who are in opposition now are in the majority, and they're voting to postpone the bill indefinitely, which means that it is dead for that session. And because every session is a new session, it means it's dead forever in that particular form. Okay, so then if it's reported out favorably, it will go back to its chamber of origin, where it now is read across the table as second reading. The title is read and debate ensues. Debate proceeds in accordance with the rules of that particular chamber. For most things, the chambers behave as though there are no limits on how long they can speak, or at least in the Senate this is the case, how long they can speak and who can speak. And there are legislators who are very fond of that provision, and they take advantage of the ability to speak innumerable times at seemingly indefinite length saying very little that's new most of the time. But after everyone has spoken who wants to speak, then the Speaker of the House, if it's the House, the President, if it's in the Senate, will call for a vote. And the vote on second reading is a voice vote. Now I'm skipping a step which concerns the Committee of the Whole and then the Committee of the Whole going back into formal session, and that's just a technicality that I don't think is important for us. Eventually, the chamber meets as a chamber presided by the Speaker of the House or the President in the Senate. And at that time, they will take a voice vote. If the voice vote that wins is usually determined by whoever's in the chair, not by what the loudest vote actually was. It's what whoever the presiding officer is, how they want the vote to go. Now, there is a protection, and that is that any legislator who doubts that the ayes really had it can ask for a division of the House. And that means that the presiding officer then has to ask those who are in favor to stand up and those who are in opposition to stand up, and they will make an actual count. And that is the vote that counts. So even if the presiding officer didn't want it to pass, if a majority of people stand up in favor, then the bill is passed. This is on second reading, but names are not called out. So this is still not a recorded vote on second reading. By the way, with regard to amendments can be introduced on the floor as well, usually in the Committee of the Whole before it goes to a final formal vote. But they can be introduced on the floor of the chamber as well. Okay, then the next day, and it has to be on a succeeding day, because no bill can pass the Colorado legislature without being read and voted upon on 2 separate days. So the next day, if not later, the third reading of the bill will be held. And at that time, once again, depending on the rules of the particular chamber, it can be debated all over again, and very often is, with nothing new being said, but everybody getting to make their speeches once more. At the end of that process, then a vote is taken, and that vote is a recorded vote. So in the House, voting is done by electronic device, and in the Senate, it's done by holding up your hand, and the President calls out your name, and the clerk records the name of the person, records your vote as being in favor or opposed. And in the House, it's done electronically. But it is recorded, and then those names are printed in the journal. So after the third reading, usually by the next day, you can look up the journal for that day, and you can see who voted yes, who voted no. Okay, so then if it passes at that point, then it will go to the other chamber, and the entire process will be repeated again. In that chamber, if it passes, it will then go to the governor. During the legislative session, the governor has 10 days within which to veto the bill if he disagrees with it. He has to send a message back to the chamber of origin saying why he is in opposition and saying that he's in opposition. The chamber then must take a vote, and that vote must be 2/3 to override the governor's veto. If the override is successful in that chamber, then it must go to the other chamber, again with the governor's objections. And that chamber, too, must override by a 2/3 vote. If the governor does not sign it within 10 days during the session or within 30 days when the legislature has adjourned, the bill becomes law anyway. Okay, so that brings us to guidelines for citizens lobbyists and what to expect when you testify at a hearing. Yes, the question is what is going on when a bill is laid over? And the bill is laid over, as you say, usually for strategic reasons. There may not be enough votes for it, and the legislator wants a little bit more time to try to twist a few more arms and get the votes. Or it may be that they don't have the vote of a legislator who will vote for it if they can tweak it a little bit. And so that gives them time to go back and introduce find an amendment that will satisfy people. Sometimes it has to do with what are you going to vote for first. Occasionally it has to do with when your party caucus is. So if your party caucus is on a Friday and the bill is up on a Thursday and you're trying to get reelected to the House and get renominated at your caucus on Friday, but you don't want to vote on that bill before your caucus, then it gets laid over till Monday, you get renominated, then you can vote on it, or something like that, Yeah. But yes, there are no limits to how long a bill can be laid over. Yes, sir. The question is it a good practice to have copies of your testimony? It is not a bad idea. It certainly, if it has any technical or substantive information that isn't easy to convey verbally, you would want to present to the clerk of the committee, preferably before you testify, but at the time you testify. They will pass it out to members. If it's something fairly simple and straightforward, legislators are buried under a blizzard of paper all the time, and so if you can make your point effectively and compactly, then verbally, then that's usually sufficient. The question is, why would you testify if you're neutral on a bill? And you may be neutral because you have concerns about the bill, you like the intent of the bill, you're in favor of the spirit of the bill, but there are things about it that you are concerned about and you want to make sure the legislators have that, and you would hope that they might amend it to fix that problem. Under those circumstances, you don't fall clearly into favorable or unfavorable, so neutral would be good. That's absolutely right. Legislators represent you. They don't necessarily, I'm speaking the way I think they think. Those of you who have been legislators can speak to this better, but they see their role as giving you a voice. And by introducing your bill, she gave you a voice. But it may be something that she's not particularly on fire about, and she has several other things that are consuming her, and she is more than happy to let you take the lead in organizing the effort. So, that's entirely compatible with our Republican form of government, our democratic process. The other side of that coin is that gives you quite a bit of influence and power, because if you're the major force behind the bill, then you can do the organizing, you can do the advocacy, and especially if you're talking to the bill drafter, if she has given you clearance to talk to the bill drafter, you can have a significant and substantive input into the way that bill ends up. But yes, being a citizen advocate may mean that you have to do some legwork. It's not just a matter of getting to stand up there and give your opinion. How do you track the scheduling of bills, and how do you track amendments? The schedule is published in the calendar, so at the legislative website, and Your entry to everything having to do with the legislature is So if you go there and you click on session information and you go to the House, click on House or Senate, and click on the calendar, and as the bills are scheduled, they will be listed on the calendar. And this in theory goes all the way to the end of the session, but in the beginning, it's just the next few days. Eventually the calendar gets filled out. That's when the bill is scheduled. Now, the bill can be unscheduled at any time, up until the day that it's supposed to be heard. It may be that whoever's running it decided they don't have the votes or it's not ready. They need to do more amendments. Then they'll ask the chair to lay it over, which they can do. Amendments are more difficult because amendments can be introduced at a number of points in the process and very often without warning. And so I don't know how. It is not unheard of for a legislator to write out an amendment in longhand during the committee hearing and say, I'm going to offer this amendment, and offer it. Now, once it becomes part of the committee report is written and it goes into the journal, then by the time it gets to the floor of the chamber, you will know what it is. But very often it's hard to anticipate what amendments are there at the time of the committee hearing. If it's an amendment that, at that point it will go, it's still a ways from being enacted. So if that's an amendment that you're opposed to, then then you need to be sure and let a friendly legislator know that, and know that you hope that in the committee of the whole, when it's deliberated in the chamber, that they raise their opposition to it. Or if it's the other way, if you want to have an amendment inserted, then you can do that before the committee starts, if you have it ready by then. But if not, then after it comes out of committee, it doesn't have the amendment you want, you still want it amended, then again, go to your legislator and say, I would like to have this amendment introduced when it goes to the floor. But until it gets into the journal, unless you're there and hear it, there's no way to know. You can, of course, listen to the session. Okay, just wrapping up then, the last topic is just guidelines for citizen lobbyists and what to expect when you testify at the legislative hearing. We've actually already covered a good bit of this, about signing in, the bill, how it's introduced, the public testimony phase then being opened. People are called in the order usually requested by the legislator who is the sponsor. Now, very often that legislator will have lined up people to testify, and that may be you. You may be, if you were involved in the bill's origin or its development, the legislator may request that you be the first to testify, or several people in a particular order. But by no means should you refrain from testifying just because you haven't been involved at that point. If you have an opinion, you're a member of the public, you have a right to testify. Okay, how do you communicate with your legislator? The first step is to call their office. So you call up their number that's listed in the registry, and you will very seldom get them, but you will get usually their staff member. And depending on what you want, if you want to just express an opinion, you can do that and say, I would like to say that I'm really in opposition to Senate Bill 14008. And they will record that and they will thank you. A staff member will usually not engage you in a discussion unless you initiated. If you have questions, what does this bill concern? The staff person may or may not know. The staff person may have someone like me whose job it is to know what's in the bills, and they'll say, well, let me pass you off to our policy aide. And then the policy person will talk to you. Now, if you want to speak to your legislator specifically, you'll almost, or very seldom will you get them just on the phone just then, but you can request an appointment. And legislators vary in that, but the vast majority of them will accept appointments, as their schedule allows. Senator Aguilar has an open door policy. You can schedule an appointment to talk to her about anything at any time, with the caveat that any time may mean, well, she has an opening 4 weeks from now or something like that. So, some of them, especially in the leadership roles, are very heavily booked up. But you can say, oh, I can't wait that long, but let me talk to her policy aide. Then you can talk to me that afternoon or the next morning usually. And then I know what your concerns are, and I'm talking to my senator almost every day, so I will convey the essence of it and help her decide, this is urgent, let's find a way to fit him in next week or something like that. Okay.
I have just a couple comments. Any other questions? Again, I want to emphasize the importance of the membership, and you have applications in there. The membership is only $30 a year, so it's a very modest amount.
Thank you.
It gives us, just helps us, and what we really want are activist members who will go down to the legislature and let them know. We do meet every Monday morning in this location when the legislature's in session. And any of you are encouraged to come to that. You can participate in our debate on these bills and perhaps even get motivated to go down and testify. So, anyway, that's it. We appreciate your coming, and